It's the day after the earthquake, the greatest political comeback of all times. Pick your cliche. It's been a remarkable 24 hours here in Washington. So much to discuss. What does it mean for America? What does it mean for us? What does it mean for the rest of the world? Welcome to Talking Politics USA. Well, I'm joined again by two of our three brilliant election night team. Adam sadly couldn't make it, but Heather Nauert, former Trump spokesperson, is here, and Jessica Taylor, data analyst, expert.
All-around political guru last night.
All-around political guru, polling guru, data guru. You both had a great night. Thanks so much for being with us. We're waking up to this. I think people in the UK are thinking, okay, this is interesting. How do we make sense of this? I mean, let's begin at the beginning. It wasn't that close, was it? It was a bit of an earthquake. I was looking at CNN this morning, and they were doing a segment in which they demonstrated that she did not improve on Joe Biden's performance in a single county all across the country. Am I right there, Jessica?
Yeah, and we're still digging through that, but by our estimation, we think the last time that didn't happen was President Hoover.
Which is, as we all know, some
time ago.
Just where we are right now, do you think the Republicans will win the House as well? Because that isn't determined yet. They've won the Senate, they've won the presidency. Will they win the House of Representatives?
Right. It looks to me like they're going to have at least a 53-seat majority in the Senate right now, possibly 54, but I think 53 looks the most likely. We at the Political Report do believe that it is leaning to Republicans, but we may not still know for a while because a lot of the outstanding races are in California. That's a heavily vote-by-mail state, so that always takes a long time to count, even under the best of circumstances. So I think we're still not going to know yet. Are Democrats still in it? They are, but I think a trifecta for Republicans is looking likely at this point.
The first thing I feel like we have to establish is what happened and why. Heather, was it the economy in the end? Was it, societal values? What do you think were the driving
I've long said that this has been about economic concerns. The average American goes to the grocery store and they buy a pound of ham for their children's sandwiches. And now it's almost $20 a pound, whereas several years ago it was maybe $6 or $7. That is being felt by families all across this country. Housing prices up, gas prices up, utilities up, everything is up to astronomical prices due to inflation. We heard a lot from the Harris-Biden administration, oh, no, it'll get better, not that big of a deal. Poo-pooed it all the way along while Americans were really hurting very badly economically. At the same time, they see masses of illegal immigrants coming across our southern border. Estimates anywhere from 10 million to 16 million over the past several years. That is not sustainable. The migrants are brought into our cities where they're put up in hotels, given food, shelter, medical care, oftentimes better services than some of our own citizens receive. So America, I think, was just frankly a little tired of that. And then they see a lot of our money going overseas too. So concerns about expenses, concerns about immigration, and then finally one cultural thing. And that is a blowback against this sort of woke agenda that has taken hold in America. We heard from some of these students who were interviewed last night talking about their concerns and some quite frankly, some odd things that they had mentioned. And I think Americans are really tired of that. Tired of boys and girls sports, tired of these items being kind of pushed down our throats. And so a backlash against those items.
Jessica, I felt like the game was up for Kamala Harris last night when you said very, very early on in the night that your first data was suggesting that there was a very large number of people who were unhappy about the direction of America. I mean, generally speaking, when you see that, incumbents do not win elections.
Yeah, a 10-point shift from 2020. 70% of the country believes that it's on the wrong track. I think it just goes back to, what the Democratic strategist James Carville said, is the economy stupid? And so I think that's what it came down to for this. And I mean, Heather's right, illegal immigration was a very big issue, but we saw Trump moving Black voters, Hispanic voters. This was not, sort of just a white voter concern. And I think that it's because, I think there's sort of been a misnomer by some that, Hispanic voters are going to vote on immigration. It's the economy. And that was the driving issue, I think, that overarchingly affects everyone.
But they do vote on immigration this way. Many of them who are here now came here legally. They went here through the proper channels. It's not easy to get through the proper channels and get to the United States and become a citizen of our country. So they're frustrated with those who've come across our border illegally and haven't gone through the proper channels. So I think immigration was also a part of their vote as well.
We often talk about international politics. You know, one of the big sort of slightly think tanky, debatable questions is, should we, in foreign policy terms, be pursuing our interests, or should we be pursuing our values? Do our interests have to be a reflection of our values or not? And you'll be very familiar with that argument. I think we tend to think of national politics as being, to a significant degree, a reflection of our values. So before we get into how a Trump presidency is or is not going to impact the world, because I'd like to just crack through some stuff, I just want to understand, like, the facts about Donald Trump haven't changed. He's, uncomfortable as it may be, now he's going to be president again. He's still an adjudicated, sexual abuser. He's still a convicted felon. He still had some of the people who work most closely with him saying that they thought he was a fascist. I mean, we can't unknow these things. These things can't be unsaid. They're on the record and all the rest of it. Do you think Americans just thought, I don't believe it, it's rubbish, the people saying it, I don't believe the court cases and all the rest of it? Or did they think, maybe I do believe it, but I don't care?
Some Americans saw the government going after Donald Trump, and some Americans have experienced that themselves, sort of that long arm of the law that is going to go after an individual if they have political differences with him. And that happened in part to Donald Trump, not in every instance, but in some instances where the government was used against him. And Americans see that, and they're fearful of it. And so that, I think that was part of it.
Jessica, what would be your analysis? Do you think, the vast number of people who went out and voted for him this time, who didn't last, just thought, I don't believe any of it, or I do believe it, but I don't care?
I think they cared more about the policies than the person. I think that they thought back and they thought I was better off when Trump was in office, when I looked at, sort of where the economy was, where different things were. I think Trump's most effective ad that I think was in the closing message, even though Harris spent more on advertising, I think his most effective ad, he had a very simple saying that Kamala and Biden broke it, I will fix it. And I think that's, if people look at that, they say, I don't like where it is. We talked about that 70% wrong track. Give him a chance. Give him another chance. Even if I don't like things about him, and we certainly saw that in the exit polling, to sort of hand him the keys again.
Do you think this very clear-eyed focus on policy, not personality, is new, or do you think it's actually always been there and maybe we just haven't dwelt on, or it hasn't been as obvious before, or it hasn't been the subject of so much focus before?
That's a great question. I'm going to have to give that one. No, really, I'm going to have to give that one a little bit more thought. I think people have always cared substantively about the policy, but on this occasion, what's happening in America is so extreme for America that I think Americans were really fed up and said, we're not going to tolerate that anymore, and made a change.
Jessica, do you have a view on that?
I mean, I do think that, we saw I remember when Trump was first elected in 2016, even in the Republican primaries, I was very shocked by, the number of particularly evangelical voters that were breaking for him, even with more, traditionally religious conservatives in the race and different things. But I think they liked sort of the way that he stood up, that he took on the system, that he was sort of this, he was an outsider. And I saw this in a lot of the Senate races last night, too, that a lot of the incumbents that lost, they'd been there for a really long time. So I think they liked this outsider. They were also sort of certainly able to paint. Biden had been there in the Senate for so long, for generations, really, since he was in his 30s. And I think they tied Harris in with that, even though she had spent most of her career outside of Washington. She tried to sort of message on that. But Donald Trump has always sort of been seen as this, he operates outside of the system. He was not a politician. And I think that has good things and bad things. But I think ultimately people thought, let's give that another try.
And then let's go back to Harris saying she wouldn't really think of anything she'd do differently.
I think that was that was maybe one of her biggest mistakes in the campaign.
But she said it twice. She said it in two key interviews that both get a lot of attention, television interviews. She was asked, what would you do differently than Joe Biden? A very simple layup question that she should be able to answer. And she said, I can't really think of much. I can't really think of anything. And that was a real fail on her part. So Americans didn't like to hear that, especially when the situation is so dire here, as many would see it, and thought she's just a continuation of everything that Biden was, and we don't want that. Another thing we haven't talked about is Biden administration corruption. People don't like to talk about it, but it is a fact. Hunter Biden laptop was, in fact, real. Sadly, there were members of our intelligence community who signed onto a letter saying that it appeared as though this was Russian disinformation. That was wrong. It was wrong to do, and it hurt our intelligence agencies and our partnership. So I think that Biden taint, and then Hunter Biden and having all these contracts with foreign governments, and who knows where the money went. Now there are IRS whistleblowers saying that the money did in fact go on to the president himself or other members of his family. That's significant. So I think there was that taint that tainted her from Joe Biden.
Okay. I think that, a lot of people in Britain and arguably the world are woke up this morning thinking, right, okay, what does this mean for us? So can we just kind of crack through some stuff and just give me your take on how, both of you, how you think these things might pan out. Let's talk about Israel and the Middle East first. If I was to guess, I would imagine Donald Trump would probably say to Israel, I'll back you all the way, just get on with it, but get it done quickly. So I suspect, some people, pro-Israelis, will think, well, that's great. They're going to get full support. They can go through it. Obviously, if you're on the other side of the argument, you're going to potentially think that's terrible. But I imagine it might bring it to a swifter, arguably more brutal conclusion. Probably will push for a deal with Saudi Arabia and to tie all that up. Not maybe great for Iran. Where do you both think that is going to play out?
Jessica, do you want to start?
I mean, I'm not a foreign policy expert. I'm more domestic policy, but I will say that, it was striking to me and we broke this down some last night that, when we were looking at the Arab vote there in Dearborn County, that there was such a protest vote for Jill Stein. And, I think that what Democrats were trying to say in the final weeks, but I think was not effectively able to get across, was if you don't like our policy, you're going to like Donald Trump's even less. And so, but again, I think those voters there, it was such an issue to them, they cared more about casting a protest vote in that instance.
And those were moments that really stuck out to me last night when we heard from a Democrat who supported Harris reluctantly, but was so upset about her policy, what he views as her support of Israel. And then we heard from a couple college students, or younger people, I should say, and they decided not to vote for Harris, despite the fact that they're Democrats, and they instead went for a third party. I thought, wow. There is something happening here in her loss of support. So to answer your question, what would Iran look like under Donald Trump? First off, Iran, I think a return to sanctions. Iran is selling more oil now than it has been in the past 6 years. They pocketed billions of dollars from oil sales, and their largest purchaser is China. China is quickly becoming one of our most significant adversaries right now. So I think we're going to look to kind of starve off Iran from being able to bring in so much money. They don't use the money that they receive for the benefit of their own people for any good in Iran. They use it rather to foment terror around the world. So I think we will look to contain Iran. And with the assistance of Israel, and I suspect some of our other allies as well, we will try to ensure that Iran does not fully develop a nuclear weapon. If Iran were to get a nuclear weapon, there's no keeping Iran in a peaceful situation. There will suddenly be a nuclear arms race all throughout the Middle East. And we've seen throughout Arab Spring and elsewhere just how tumultuous that region can be. You don't want that. Iran has to be contained. They need to be stopped. We need to work with Israel to do that. However, we still need to find a solution for the Palestinians. And we don't hear a lot of the Arab nations talking about what they could do to help. Whether it's Egypt, Jordan already does a lot, but other Arab nations could do a lot. And frankly, when I was at the State Department and would travel with Secretary Pompeo or Rex Tillerson, the prior Secretary of State, and we would talk with these Arab nations about the Palestinian issue, they didn't want to talk about it. They said, let's talk about Israel. Let's talk about Israel. They don't want to deal with the Palestinians themselves. And until the entire region comes together to try to help these people and try to get Hamas and other terror organizations out, I'm afraid we're stuck in a pretty tough spot.
But I think also voters, this was not a foreign policy election. I think are you going to get a different foreign policy in some of these instances? Yes, but it was ultimately, we did not see that as a key issue driving the voters last night. And, the last foreign policy driven election we had, it's typically only when American troops are involved. So this was with Iraq and Afghanistan. So this was, again, yes, it's going to be different, And we're going to see that, I think, especially with a Republican Congress and probably a Republican House in that instance, and probably a more isolationist foreign policy as well. But it was still not a driving factor when voters were deciding, I don't think.
Just on that subject, in so much as voters did have a view about it, Jessica, do they want America to just be out of Ukraine? Out. They just want Ukraine to settle. The war's just gone on too long. They want to get out. They stop spending money.
Yeah.
They want NATO to stump up, or do they want to go further and just get out of NATO and get out of kind of alliances of that kind altogether?
I mean, I think that Trump has certainly taken the Republican Party in a more isolationist direction than sort of the Republican, the Reagan Republican Party and different things. And I think we will continue to see that probably. But again, I'm not sure that most voters think of it in that way. I think the MAGA movement certainly has taken that direction, and more Republican candidates that we see in that regard. I think there's just a fear among voters, though, of having any international entanglements and what that could mean. Yes, it's money now, but what does that mean down the line?
Yeah, and think about the last 25 years of our country since 9/11. We've had American troops, alongside yours, of course, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and elsewhere. Americans feel that still each and every day. We have a generation of men and some women who came home really hurt by what they went through, and they are our incredible heroes. But many of them, now old enough to have children themselves, don't want to have their children in that same kind of situation, what Donald Trump calls endless wars. So I understand that. We still want to do the right thing abroad by our allies. We want a world that's peaceful where we won't have to send troops. So that will require some diplomatic engagement and some other kinds of engagements so that we don't get so far down the road that we have to send troops somewhere.
It's been a great pleasure to have you both as our guests this week. Thanks very much for joining me today. That is all we have time for. Thanks very much. If you were watching our election night show, thanks for sticking with us. Thank you this time for watching or listening, whichever you were doing. But for now, goodbye from Washington once again.